Warning: you should never ever allow fresh film to be exposed to light except when taking a photo. Never take unused Polaroid film out of its cassette unless you are in a dark room and know what you're doing. Film is light sensitive, and anything other than complete darkness can ruin fresh film. So I have here a Polaroid I took during a lightning storm, and you can see on the left where the lightning bolt struck the ground and exposed the film. Now, the nature of film is that light enters your camera through the lens, and anywhere on the piece of film that light touches gets exposed. Now, this lightning storm was at night, so only the lightning bolt shows on the film, and everywhere else I have all this dark, black space, and it kind of feels like a waste to have so much film only to use such a small section of it. I mean, maybe I could have framed this shot better so it was centered a little more, or I could have used some sort of zoom adapter like the SX37 possibly. But once you press that red button on your Polaroid camera, you're committed to whatever your camera's pointed at. Because when that shutter closes back, the camera immediately ejects the film through these rollers here, and all the developer chemicals in this little pod in the back of your Polaroid film get squished all across the image you just exposed. Every time, this is how your photo ejects. So if you could somehow prevent your camera from ejecting your film, then your photo never gets pushed through the rollers. If your photo never gets pushed through the rollers, then your photo never gets developed, which means you'd be able to take another picture on the same piece of film. So the reason film is able to produce an image at all is because there's lots of tiny little light-sensitive particles embedded in the emulsion behind this clear plastic cover. When light hits those particles, they undergo a chemical change. This is not reversible, which is why it's so important to keep your film in a dark, light-tight space, and to never take your film out of the camera unless you're in a dark room. Once light has exposed the film, it can never be undone. This is the double-edged sword of double exposure Polaroid photography, because anytime you take a second exposure on your film, the sections of your film that have already been exposed to light will get re-exposed and become twice as bright like they did here. And I'll tell you how we prevent that in a moment. So if you look in the back left corner of your Polaroid camera, and this is the case for both folding cameras as well as box-type cameras, you'll see this tiny metal piece sticking out. You can see it a bit to the left of where my tool is pointing there. That little piece of metal is called the pick arm, and when you press your shutter button, and I'm just going to show you on this dummy film pack here, the pick arm engages in the top left corner of your film pack and pushes the uppermost piece of film forward just a few millimeters, which is just enough to push the film into the camera's rollers so it can squish all that lovely developer chemical over the picture and spit the picture out. And I'll show you here on the Polaroid 1 Step, or Polaroid 1000 in Europe, that it's the same thing here, and that little pick arm is the reason you're limited to only taking one photo per piece of film. So, if we could somehow stop that pick arm from pushing our film into the rollers, then maybe we can trick the camera into thinking it's ejected a piece of film. That would allow us to use the same piece of film to take as many photos on it as we want. And the way we do that is by making what's called a double exposure pick, or a double exposure tool. The way a double exposure tool works is by sliding it into the film pack, and I'm going to do this on a slightly modified film pack. You see behind this flimsy black piece of plastic, there's a cutout that the film gets pushed through during ejection. You can see if I push down on the top piece of film, everything gets pushed down and we're given a little space to insert something into the film cassette. We're going to slide that double exposure tool into the film pack on top of the film cover on the left side of the opening, right here where this little black tab is, nice and snug against the left edge of the cassette. And you can see as I slide the tool into the film cassette, it goes all the way to the back corner of our film. You'll notice this little notch in the film pack here in the upper back corner. This is where the pick arm engages with the film to push it forward. So you can imagine now, with this piece of metal in the way, we can stop the pick arm from ejecting the film, allowing us to take another photo. An important thing to note here is that this bend in the bottom of the double exposure tool is made to prevent the tool itself from getting pushed into the rollers. The fact that it's flush and flat means it sits comfortably against the rollers without getting ejected, while also giving you a physical sense that the tool has been fully inserted. It's also helpful since you have to insert the tool in the dark, because when you push it into the film pack and move this flimsy black plastic, you risk letting light into your film pack. And then you get weird patterns like this in your film from the light leaking into the camera. In fact, that flimsy black plastic is actually a light shield, and it's there to keep your film safe from unwanted light exposure. So since all this has to be done in the dark, you can imagine that the sharp bend in the base of the tool helps to make it easier to tell which end is which and when it's been fully inserted. So you know, when you have a fresh pack of Polaroid film, it comes with a dark slide on top, like this. When you put it in the camera and close the door, the dark slide gets ejected automatically. This is the same process that takes place when you take a photo and the film gets ejected, only without shutter speed adjustments and without opening the aperture. And we're going to use that to our advantage later when we actually take a double exposure, but I just wanted to show you how this tool works. So I have our modified film pack here, and again this is already used film. You should never be able to see this in any kind of light. And here I'm just going to remove the double exposure tool real quick. And normally, when I insert this, the camera is going to automatically eject whatever is on top because it assumes there is a dark slide. But if I put this double exposure tool into the film pack and insert the film into the camera, and by the way, I know I'm saying modified film pack a lot. I'll tell you how it's modified in a little bit. But if I go ahead and insert that into the camera, then you can see the camera can't eject anything. That shows that we were successful in blocking the pick arm and preventing the ejection process. And you can see on the film counter on the back that the camera thinks this is a full pack of film. So if I try to take a photo right now, that's my first exposure. The film doesn't eject, which means whatever I just took a photo of is locked into that top piece of unejected film. So now if I want to put a second photo on top of that, I just take a second picture. But wait, the film counter has gone down by 2. It's now at 8, but we haven't ejected any film. Well, the camera doesn't know any better, so every time you press the shutter button, the film counter will go down by 1. As long as you don't reach 0, that's okay. These are still all properly metered photos. But when the film counter does reach 0, it starts running an automatic ejection process. It doesn't open the aperture, it doesn't meter the shot, it doesn't adjust the shutter speed, it just ejects the film just like it would with the dark slide of a fresh pack. So if you don't keep up with how many photos you've taken, then you might get to 0 without knowing it, and then you're just going to be ejecting film and you'll be wasting it. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but if you find you're getting really close to 0, and you're worried that you're going to waste your film, there's a simple way to reset your film counter back to 10. All you have to do is get to a dark room, open your camera, pull the film pack out, and make sure you leave your double exposure tool in the film pack. Then reinsert your film pack into the camera, making sure the double exposure tool is pushed all the way back before you close the door. Then close the door, and the camera will think you've inserted a brand new pack. And now, you're back to 10 shots on the counter. So you can also use the double exposure tool for not just double exposures, but for allowing you to take unfinished film out of your camera, store it somewhere else, and then put it back into your camera without your camera automatically ejecting and wasting your film. So you'll remember I kept saying that film pack was a modified film pack. You'll notice here that we cannot insert this tool into a normal pack of film because there's this little black plastic lip in the way. And remember, you must insert these tools in a dark space. So by extension, if you have a pack of film that you want to use for double exposure, you have to remove this lip in the dark as well. This lip is normally stuck to the film pack until you insert it into your camera, at which point it snaps forward. So after you've obtained or created a double exposure tool and you've decided what pack of film you want to use for the double exposure, you'll just snap this plastic piece off by pulling it upward like this. So where does one get one of these tools? Well, if you're DIY inclined and want to save money, then you're gonna make one yourself. Otherwise, you can order one through the link in the description and skip all this DIY stuff I'm about to discuss. But fair warning, these are pretty easy to make. How do you make one? Well, you're gonna need an empty Polaroid film pack. It doesn't matter what kind, it can be SX70, 600, or I-type because we won't be using the batteries anyway. Now you're gonna basically break it open or cut it open. They're easy to break, but be careful because the aluminum spring in here has sharp edges and you don't want to hurt yourself. You also don't want to cut the metal, so if you use scissors, make sure you push the spring down. And you're just going to break that plastic away enough that you can remove the spring and battery pack from your cassette. I know I said they were easy to break open, and I swear every time before this they were really easy to break open, but I think I'm going to opt for the scissors this time. So I'm pushing down on the metal spring here to be sure that when I put the scissors in through the film ejection cutout, that I don't actually cut the metal itself. So I'm just going to tear that away. That way I can get to the front face, and you want to be sure you get the front face of the cassette here removed, and then your spring and battery pack should slide out. It's pretty easy to snap the face off the cassette, again being as careful as possible not to run your fingers along the edge of that metal. Once it's snapped away, you can pull on the lower edge of the metal gently. You may feel more comfortable using pliers or grips for this, and it should slide out effortlessly. It has these two small metal tabs that rest on these detents on the battery pack to keep everything together, but it comes apart effortlessly, and then you're ready to start cutting. For your reference, when I say the bottom of the aluminum spring, I'm referring to the side that has the two metal tabs and this one central tab. So I've gone ahead and marked with a Sharpie what side is the bottom with a capital B, and I'll show you that there's a few key locations on this metal that are important to us. We're only going to be using the left side of the metal, although you can make one of these using the right side of the spring as well. If you have cut-resistant gloves, now would be a great time to get them, but I've done this a few times without any issues, so just be careful. So if I lay the tool I've already made on top of our metal, you can kind of get an idea of how we're going to make this. You'll notice at the top left corner there's this little ramp. This is what the pick arm slides against as it attempts to engage with the film. If you look just a little bit below the ramp bit, you'll see this indentation going all the way down the side of the metal. And this indentation going down the side of the metal is going to be our guideline for cutting. I'm going to use my calipers for this, but you won't have to use any kind of measuring equipment. You can use a Polaroid for this, but I'm just going to use my calipers to show you that about 85 millimeters from the top, we're going to make a sort of 45-degree angle and cut the whole piece of metal. If you don't have calipers or a ruler, obviously, then just line up a Polaroid against your metal, and realize that we want to make our cut somewhere below the actual image square. That way you can be sure your tool won't block the film. So I'm going to hold this Polaroid next to the piece of metal, making sure that the top of the Polaroid is flush with the top of the metal. And I'm going to make a mark right about there, where the bottom of the image lines up. And I'll just make one more mark down here at the bottom of the metal on the left edge of that center tab. I'll wait to cut that. So now, we're going to get started at the top corner, cutting down with the scissors snugly against that little crease beside that ramp. And we're going to cut downward as straight as possible along the edge of this indent that I mentioned before. We want to preserve that indent on our tool, because if we cut too far off of it, then our tool will be too thin. And I'm just slowly cutting down the edge of that indent toward the bottom of the piece of metal, trying to maintain as straight a cut as possible. Be very, very careful not to let your fingers run against that metal, because cutting it with scissors usually makes a lot of barbs and just makes it all around sharper. I'll remind you again that cut-resistant gloves are encouraged. So your strip of metal is almost definitely going to curl like this. That's okay, just keep cutting because we'll straighten it out once we're done. And we'll just keep cutting with our scissors all the way to that little line we made. And then we're going to change the direction of our cut by anywhere from about 30 to 50 degrees toward the middle of the bottom of the metal. So you see my scissors are now pointing toward that center tab at the bottom. And we're just going to cut all the way to the edge until this side is separated and only connected at the bottom. Now we're going to use our scissors to finally cut the bottom along that line we made next to that tab, making sure we don't poke ourselves with the metal. This will completely separate it, leaving you with metal scraps and hopefully a very rough double exposure tool. Of course, we can't use it yet because we need to get all the sharp, jagged edges off of it, and we need to shape it so it's mostly flat. So now you really need a pair of pliers, and some sandpaper or a sanding sponge if you have one. The first spot I always use the pliers on is right here, where we made our little 45-degree cut, because there's always a little barb here that needs to be flattened out so it doesn't snag us or our film. If I turn it to the side, you can see it a little more clearly. So I'll just take the flat portion of our pliers and press it down on this barb to flatten it out. And now you can see there's no barb there. We're going to continue using the flat portion of our pliers to go down the tool and get it uncurled into a roughly flat shape, just like we just did. So I'll start from right above the barbed portion and flatten it. Then I'll move further down and flatten it, gently bending it while I go to coax it into the flat shape we want. Your tool may also have a slight twist to it, and you can feel free to twist it in the opposite direction to try to get that twist out of it. You may notice little sections where it's still bent, and you can go ahead and straighten those portions as well. Just try not to bend it too sharply in either direction. Eventually you'll get to the little sloped bit where we started our cut. Do not flatten this out. Keep the sloped piece. You'll want to flatten it just a little bit so it's not so steep, because otherwise it could scrape your film as you insert the tool. But do not let it go flat. And now I'm just going to shape the entire tool using my fingers one last time, being very careful not to slide my fingers too much against the edges because we haven't sanded this down yet. Now you can see it's mostly flat. It has a slight curvature to it, but that's not a problem, as long as it's not too wide and not curled up and can slide into the film cassette. I'm usually never satisfied, so I'm just going to coax it a little bit more into that flat shape so I'll be happy with it. And I think that's just about where I want it. So yeah, I think I'm happy with that. So we've got some finishing touches to add to our tool. I'm going to grab the dummy film pack and just kind of show you roughly how this is going to line up if we tried to insert it into our film pack. So I'll hold it up next to it and just kind of give you a view of what it looks like. And so you can kind of see that if we tried to put this into our film pack, it would get stuck down near the developer pods. So I'm going to try sliding it in, and it looks like it's catching on the film pack. So what that tells me is I need to get my pliers and flatten that slope out just a tiny bit more. That way it doesn't snag on my film when I try to insert it. And I think that's fine. So now I'm going to try this other empty film pack, and I'll slide it in just to show you that for sure it slides in really easily. So we know that it is at least made correctly. But the issue is that you can see if I try to push it in all the way into the film cassette, well, now it's stuck. If this were like a normal film cassette, then I wouldn't be able to retrieve my tool, and it might even get caught in the camera's rollers during ejection. Well, we're going to fix that as well. You're going to take the flat tips of your pliers and clamp them down on the bottom portion of your tool next to this corner at a 45-degree angle from the long portion of the tool, kind of like this. Then you're going to try your best to basically fold this whole piece of metal around so that it points in the same direction as the long portion of the tool, kind of pointing downward. Like this. It's okay if it's not perfectly straight, as long as it doesn't stick out past the left edge of your tool, and if it does, just use your pliers to twist it away. And now we're going to flatten that little bend out completely using our pliers. And just gently use your fingertips to make sure that it's flat and that there are no places where the metal catches. If there are any, just press them flat with the pliers, and now we're ready to sand. But keep your pliers close by because we're not done with them. So I have here a 180 grit sanding sponge. Any kind of sanding sponge or sandpaper 600 grit or lower should be ideal for this because we want to coarsely grind away the sharp edges on this tool. If you're using sandpaper, I encourage you to fold it over once or twice just to protect your fingers. But I just take the sanding sponge, and I start at the top right corner where we started our first cut. And I just roughly sand parallel to the edge of the tool. It's likely going to cut our sanding sponge, but that's okay. Then I sort of go over the top and the bottom of the tool to really be sure I've smoothed out that sharp corner. And then I just continue around the tool with whatever feels right, being very careful not to cut myself. Hopefully you can see close up here how that sharp corner has turned more into a rounded edge, and I can just check with my finger that it's smooth now. And I'm just going to keep doing that all around the perimeter of the tool until everything is smoothed out. If you find that you need to shape it back up a little bit, that's okay too. Just remember we're looking for a roughly flat, straight shape. And you can check that your edges are safe by lightly grazing your fingertip over them and seeing if you feel a catch. Don't press too hard when looking for snags, because we just need to get rid of the super sharp stuff. Here, where we made our fold, is bound to have quite a few pointy bits, so don't be afraid to spend some extra time smoothing those out. And don't forget to round off any corners, because they can hurt you and your film. Now you should have something that looks about like this. We're almost done making our tool. We just have two final touches to add. Go ahead and take your tool, and if you have a spare empty film cassette, you can even use the one we broke open if it's still roughly intact. Push your tool sloped end first into the film cassette, and using a marker, just draw a line where the bottom of the film cassette touches the tool. You can also slide it against one of the brand new packs of film, and do the same thing, just resting the tool against the top of the cassette. If you don't have any spare packs of film laying around, just use an actual piece of Polaroid film. Lay the tool on top of the piece of Polaroid film and make sure the top of the tool is aligned with the top of the Polaroid, and just mark with a marker on the tool where the bottom of the Polaroid touches it. If you prefer something a little bit more precise, then you need to make your mark 110 millimeters from the end of the tool, or about 4 7/16 inches. This is actually about 3 millimeters longer than Polaroid film. So if you do make your mark using a piece of Polaroid film, then you need to add a few extra millimeters to your measurement to account for that difference. So the reason we drew that line is because we need to make a 90-degree bend in our tool. That way it sits flush against the front of the film cassette. You can do this with a film cassette just by sliding the tool into the cassette and folding it against the front of it. Or you can use your pliers and do the same thing. I'm going to use my pliers just to make the bend a little bit sharper. That way it sits really flat against the film cassette. So if I slide this into the film cassette, you can see how it fits in, but it can't go all the way to the corner. And that's because of this black plastic lip we talked about before. Remember, you cannot insert these tools into a film pack unless this plastic piece is broken off. So now you can see it sits flush against the front face of the film cassette. If your tool does not sit flush against the film cassette, then either 1, it's not pushed in all the way, or 2, you placed your bend too far down the tool and you need to flatten it back out and make your 90-degree bend a little bit higher up the tool. You'll also see that we have a lot of metal hanging off of the bottom of the tool. If we try to put that in our camera, the film door won't be able to close because that metal is in the way. So we'll have to pull the tool back out, and we're going to cut about half of it off, so about 7 millimeters from your 90-degree bend. Just enough that that little overhang is shorter than the film cassette itself. And we'll snip that off, and we're going to sand those corners and edges down one last time. Now, when I slide it into the film cassette once more, you can see that it's flush against the front of the film pack and I don't have any excess metal hanging off. So if you've reached this point, then congratulations. You've got a double exposure tool. And you can take as many photos as you want without ever ejecting a single piece of film. So just to remind you, you only ever insert these in the dark. Otherwise, the light can get into your film and ruin your film. Also, to insert these, you have to press down on the film to get behind the light shield and on top of the film. But in the dark, you can't see if the tool is inserted on the top piece of film or if it's been stuck between two pieces of film. So you need to use your fingers to feel for the tool sliding into the film pack. You also won't be able to insert the tool into a pack of film until it's been put in the camera because of that black plastic lip we snapped off before. So to use these, I suggest you take your new unused film pack, your camera, and your tool to a dark room. Put the new film in your camera without any tool, let the dark slide eject, and then take the film back out. Snap off the plastic lip, insert the tool into the film pack, put everything back in the camera, and if nothing comes out of the camera, then the tool was inserted successfully and you're ready to take your double exposure. So really quickly, I just thought it would be useful to point out that there's a big difference between the sounds your camera makes when it's ejecting actual film or a dark slide and when it's not ejecting anything but just trying to eject something. This can be really useful for diagnosing if your camera has erroneously ejected something, or if your camera should be ejecting something but nothing's coming out. So if you have a double exposure tool in your film pack, or if your film pack is empty and there's no film in it and there's nothing to eject, your camera should sound like this. But you'll notice if there's actually film in your camera or something for the camera to eject, you can almost hear that it has to put forth more effort to push something through the rollers, so I'll play that for you now. So once again, effortless, there's nothing to eject. And then film ejecting. But what about when you've taken both exposures and are done with a piece of film? How do you make it eject? You have to go back to your darkroom once you're done taking exposures, and then you can safely remove the film pack from the camera, remove the tool from the film, and then slide the film pack back into the camera. When you close the door, the camera will think it's a fresh pack of film and eject whatever is on top because it assumes that there is a dark slide. This will send your Polaroid through the rollers, and now your double exposed film will be developed. Bear in mind that once you do this, your film counter is reset to 10, but now you only have 7 pieces of film in your camera, so you always have to keep track of how many pieces of film you've used. And that's really all there is to it. Just keep in mind that anytime your first exposure has dark space, your second exposure can be used to fill those dark sections in. But this comes with the caveat that any bright spots in your first exposure will be twice as bright after the second exposure. So I encourage you to follow along to learn how to control what actually gets included in your exposures, and to control overexposing the same spot twice by using dark spots to your advantage using film masks. So I have these photos here, and these are all double exposures. In normal double exposures, you have dark areas in the first exposure that are used for an actual image in the second exposure. In the case of these, I've basically chosen exactly where the dark sections are for the first exposure, and limited the second exposure to only touching those portions of the film. With this one, the first exposure looked roughly like this, so that everything in the image gets included in the photo, except this heart-shaped section in the middle. Then, the second exposure looked like this, so that the center heart gets exposed, but everything else is blocked out so it doesn't get re-exposed. This one is based off of a beach house song, and once again, the first exposure was something like this, where everything gets exposed but the letters. If I didn't do a second exposure, then this photo would have ejected the black text. But the second exposure blocks off everything but the text, so that the text gets filled in. This last one is the same principle, Only instead of using two separate masks, I designed it to be really symmetrical so that after the first exposure, I could just flip it horizontally and take the second exposure. So this is going to be about creating masks for your double exposures. First, I want to show you how they work. So I've got this dummy film pack here for demonstration purposes, and I'm going to use these two masks. These masks are designed to be virtually the same size as the Polaroid film itself, because these masks slide into the film pack and selectively block light from hitting areas of the film. Before we move forward, remember, don't do any of this in light. You have to prep and modify your film packs in a dark room. You have to insert your masks and your double exposure tool in a dark room. If you don't, your film will get ruined. So what modifications do you need to do to your film before you use a mask? Well, of course, that black plastic lip has to be removed because, again, you can't do double exposures with it in the way. But on top of that, Polaroid film packs are very, very tightly packed. If you use a brand new full pack of film, it may be impossible to insert film masks, and if you do manage to insert one, you'll probably rupture the developer pod in the back of your film, and then you'll accidentally develop a completely blank image. So first you need to put your new pack of film into your camera, close the door, and let the dark slide eject. You need a spare empty film cassette or a light tight box. And then turn all the lights off. Once the dark slide has ejected, take your film cassette out of the camera and place the camera somewhere you can locate it easily without knocking it over. Remember, you're doing this in the dark, so try to have a somewhat clear and usable workspace. Now you'll use your thumb to locate the wide part toward the bottom of the film cassette. This is where the developer pods are in the film. Very gently, press down on the opposite end of the film, where there's no developer, and push the film out of the cassette. Make sure you don't press down too hard or push too hard, because you could damage the developer pod or even the film emulsions under the plastic. Once the film is pushed out enough that you can grab it, gently place your fingers around it to guide the film out of the cassette as you push it with your other hand. Do not pull the film by the developer pod. Only push it out of the cassette. Once it's completely out, you need to transfer it to either your empty film pack or your light tight box. If you don't have a spare film cassette or just aren't going to use one, then just place your piece of virgin film inside the light tight box. When you're ready to use this film, you can slide it back into a film cassette. Ideally, however, you transfer your film directly to another cassette, which you will still have to store in a light safe container. So if you have a spare cassette handy, simply take the film you just removed and set down the fresh film pack you just removed it from. Pick up the empty cassette and use your thumb to press down one side of the metal spring as close to the developer end as possible, and you'll slide your film into the cassette on that corner to get it started. Again, make sure you're not grabbing it by the developer pod. Your finger should be on the film square. Once you feel the film has been inserted into the cassette, be sure you feel it on top of the spring. Just because it slides into the cassette doesn't mean it's actually on top. Once you confirm it's on top, then you can slowly slide it in so that the other corner goes in. From there, gently push down on the top of the film and use both hands to slide the film all the way into the cassette, being sure it goes under this little lip in the back, all the way until it stops. And make sure you don't put too much pressure on the developer pod while you do this. Fun fact, this is also how you use I-Type 600 film in your vintage cameras. Simply transfer the I-Type film to a 600 or SX70 cassette. Once the film has been transferred, congrats, you only have to do that 3 more times. I found that this works best with only 4 pieces of film in a cassette, sometimes even less, because as you slide your masks into the film pack, it increases the pressure on the film and the developer pods and can cause problems. So remove and transfer the other 3 pieces of film, and then you're ready to use some masks, which I'll show you how to make in just a little bit. So make sure you've removed that black plastic lip from your film pack. Your double exposure tool will not work unless it's removed, and you must remove it in the dark. You can go back in the video if you need to see how that's done. Do not insert your double exposure tool yet. Take whichever mask you want your first exposure to be, and while pushing gently down on the film near the developer pod but still on the actual film square, slide a corner of the mask into the cassette just like when we transferred the film, and then slide the other corner in. This is a little tricky at first, And you need to be sure your mask doesn't have any pieces sticking off of it that could snag on the cassette edge, or else it'll get stuck and you'll be in the dark, confused why it isn't working. That's why this one is sealed in laminating plastic. That way it won't snag on any edges when I slide it in, and it keeps the mask centered in space where I want it to be. While sliding the mask in, make sure you can feel it on top of the film with your thumb. If you can't, but you're pretty sure it's in all the way, then chances are you accidentally slid it in between two pieces of film. Simply pull it out and slide it back in, pressing the film down just a tiny bit harder to make sure there's room for the mask to slide in on top. Once it's slid in, grab the mask just like when you transferred the film and push down on it gently using your thumbs to slide it all the way to the back of the film cassette under that little lip. Now you can insert the double exposure tool like we practiced before. Press down on the mask and film to give the tool room to slide into the film pack, once again using your thumb to make sure you don't accidentally slide it between two pieces of film. Slide it all the way to the back of the cassette until the bent portion of the tool rests flatly against the front of the film cassette. If the mask is slid all the way in, and the tool is on top of the mask and slid all the way in, then you can insert your film into your camera and close the door. Of course, the camera will attempt to eject a dark slide when in fact it's not ejecting anything. Now, your film counter will say 10, but remember we only put 4 pieces of film inside, and every time you take an exposure the counter will go down by 1, regardless of how much film you actually have in the camera. Once you've taken your first exposure, go back to your dark room, open the camera, take the film cassette out of the camera, remove the double exposure tool, remove the mask, make sure your film is all the way to the back of the cassette, and then slide your second exposure mask into the film cassette, just like you did with the first one. Then slide in your double exposure tool on top. Also, if you're using the Polaroid neutral density filter because you're using 600 or I-type film in an SX70 camera, then you'll have to insert the filter after you've inserted the tool, or else the tool will get caught on the ND filter. So you'll have to insert your mask, then your tool on top of the mask, and then you can insert the ND filter on top of that. Once the tool is in, you can put the film back into your camera, close the door, let the camera run its dark slide process, and then you're free to go take your second exposure. Once you've taken all the exposures you want, go back to your dark room, take your film pack out of the camera, remove the ND filter, pull out the double exposure tool, remove the mask, and make sure the film is pushed all the way to the back of the cassette. Then you just put your film cassette back into your camera, close the door, and now when the camera thinks it's ejecting a dark slide, it will eject and develop your double exposed photo. So that's how you use the double exposure masks, but how do you make them? So we want to make something as similar to an actual Polaroid as possible, because remember, these are being inserted into film packs, and so they have to be compatible with the camera and the film's dimensions. That means mimicking the film's size as well as its rigidity, because Polaroids aren't flimsy and don't bend super easily. So we're going to start with a black piece of card paper. I don't remember what weight this is, but it's pretty sturdy. Now you can avoid all of the stuff I'm about to do if you have a printer, because I have a template in the description that you can use if you print it and stick it to your black paper with some double-sided tape. If you print that out, make sure you do it at 100% size, and to be sure it's printing at the right scale, make sure the templates are the same size as a Polaroid, and you can double check using a ruler that has metric units. Now I'm going to use my calipers for this, but you won't have to. So I'm just going to measure the dimensions of a piece of Polaroid film. And you can see roughly the length of a piece of Polaroid film is about 107 to 108 millimeters long. And yeah, you can see this is about 107.5 millimeters long. And now I'm going to measure the width of the Polaroid film. And that should be about 87 to 88.5 millimeters wide. So I'm just locking my calipers into place at that width, because I want to use my calipers to mark off the width of a Polaroid on this black piece of paper. So I'm going to do that once on the top edge here, and then I'll move over and do it again. That way I can make 2 columns of Polaroid-sized cutouts. I'll do it on the bottom edge as well, that way I can use my straight edge to connect these lines. And now I'm going to do the same thing with that length measurement of the Polaroids, which was about 107.5 millimeters. And I'm just going to lock the calipers in place again. And I'll mark those dimensions off on the left and right edges of the black paper. I'm only going to do this once, because I only need 2 masks to cut out, so this top row on the piece of paper is enough. And I'll mark that off there as well. And now I'm just closing the calipers and putting them away. So now I'm going to get my ruler, and I'll just connect the lines that I marked off. That way I can get really nice, straight masks to insert into my Polaroid film packs. Remember, we wanted these to be as close to Polaroid size as possible, so mimicking the accurate dimensions of a piece of Polaroid film is kind of essential. So these 2 columns I'm marking off will form my 2 Polaroid masks. And if I can get that straight, I'll go ahead and connect these 2 lines. And then I'll go ahead and turn the paper around, and I'll use my straight edge once again to connect our length dimensions. And basically this will allow us to mark off our 2 Polaroid-sized masks. And so now I have 2 masks that are ready to be cut out. But before we begin cutting anything, we need to be aware of where the actual film square is on our makeshift Polaroids. So when I say film square, I mean this part where the actual image forms on the film. And so I'm just going to use my calipers to measure all the margins around the film square. So on the right, we should have a margin of about 5.5 millimeters of space. And it should be roughly the same on the left. About 5.5 millimeters of space. So I'm going to use my calipers, locking them in place at this measurement, to mark off the left and right boundaries of our film squares. So that's the left boundary of the film square for that mask. I'm going on the top and bottom edges because, again, I need to use a straight edge to connect these, that way I can actually make a film square. And I'll mark it off the same way on the second mask. And now, I'm going to loosen the calipers up so I can measure the top margin of the Polaroid film, and that should be about 6.5 millimeters instead of 5.5. So I'll lock the calipers in at around 6.5 millimeters. And then I'll do the same thing. I'm just going to mark off the upper margin of the film on our masks to be. And now the last boundary for our film square is the bottom boundary, near the developer pod on the film. And that measures around 21 millimeters wide. So once again, I'm going to lock the calipers in place here. If you need to draw these out, you can just use my measurements. You don't have to measure them yourself. I adjusted my calipers to 22 millimeters to make sure I had plenty of space. And so now I'm just going to mark off those bottom boundaries of the film squares here. Once on the left edge, and once on the right edge. And now, I'll be able to use my ruler to demarcate where the boundaries of my film squares are on our masks. That way I'll know exactly where I can form an image on my film. By the way, yes, it's called double exposure photography, and I'm only making 2 masks, but there's no reason you should be limited to only 2 exposures. I've done triple exposures, and theoretically you could even make 9 of these masks and make yourself a 9x9 grid of photos on one piece of Polaroid film. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, other than the fact that it would just be really complicated and probably pretty headache-inducing. So once my film squares are drawn, I can start deciding exactly how I want to double expose my film. You can make this really simple, or you can make it pretty complex, as you've seen. I'm just going to do something really straightforward and draw a line from one corner of the film square to the opposite corner of the film square. Now I'll use my pencil to mark which side of that line I want to keep and which side I want to cut out. So just using my ruler, drawing one line connecting both corners. And I think I want to keep this side. So I'll cut the other side off. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other mask. So once again, connecting the exact same corners I connected on the other one. I'll just draw one line, only this time I'm going to cut the side that I kept on the other exposure, and I'll keep this side. So now my masks are ready to be cut out. So I'll just use my metal ruler and my X-Acto knife, and I'll start cutting, trying to cut as straight as possible, because remember we want these to be as straight as a piece of Polaroid film would be. And now I'm ready to go ahead and cut out the actual exposure sections of the masks. So this triangle that I decided I would get rid of, I'm going to go ahead and cut it out. And remember, by doing this, we're basically creating sections where light can't reach the film and where it has to touch the film. And now, of course, the fact that you can see through that triangle that I cut out means that light can get through it. So if we insert that into our film pack, that means light can touch our film through that hole that I just cut out. And now I'll go ahead and do the same thing to our other mask, cutting out the triangle, but on the other side, so that effectively we'll be creating two halves of a whole image. And if I overlap them, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Where one allows light through, the other blocks it out, and vice versa. And so once again, you can see how they kind of form two parts of one whole. Now the last step is crucial because remember, you'll be using these and swapping them out in the dark, and if they're not oriented properly, you can really mess things up. If I'm in the dark and my first exposure is taken like this, I may get mixed up and accidentally insert my second mask like this. And then I've wasted a piece of film because it wasn't inserted properly. And what if to your fingers the masks feel really similar and you can't tell which one is which? How can you tell which side is the top or which side is the left? You can't. That's why we cut out indexing marks on our masks. They'll help you discern which side of your film is the left side, and by extension what side your double exposure tool should go on, and which exposure you're on, all through tactile feedback. So for the first exposure, I'm just going to cut out a little square in the lower left corner, leaving about a centimeter of space on the left. And on the second exposure, I'm going to cut out kind of a capital M shape, so that it comes to a sharp point that I can detect really easily in the dark using nothing but my fingers. Again on the left, leaving about a centimeter of space. Once that's done, and both masks are complete, head to a dark room. Slide the mask in on top of your film, and remember, no more than 4 pieces of film in the pack if you're going to do this. Slide the double exposure tool in on top, and take your first exposure. Repeat for the second exposure, and you're done. Personally, I recommend you use the template, because it's much easier to use, which is why I'm going to show you a slightly more complex mask using the template. So I want to make a double exposure that makes it look like my head has been replaced with a Polaroid camera. So in this little square in the middle, I want a photo of my camera, and outside of that, I just want a photo of myself from the shoulders up. I measured how to frame my shot and everything ahead of time, and then I edited the template in Microsoft Word so that my cut lines are already on it. You can do this, or you can just draw directly onto the paper. The benefit of using the template, aside from not having to measure every little thing, is that you can see your lines much more easily on it. So I'm going to put a bunch of double-sided tape all over the black paper. And the reason for this is that I want my template to stick in as many places as possible, because when I cut it out, I still want my printed template to stick to the black paper. So I want to get as much tape coverage as possible to ensure that everything stays together. And then I'm going to try my best to align this printout with the edge of the black paper. Once I've verified that everything is stuck, I'll take my X-Acto knife and my ruler as a straight edge, and I'll cut out my 2 masks. I'm going to do this roughly the same way I did before with the manually measured ones. I'm just going to cut out the outer border, basically creating a piece of paper the same size as a Polaroid. I would also suggest that you cut along the inside of the black lines. This will make your masks a little bit smaller than the template measurements. Ultimately, it's better for your masks to be a little bit small than them be too big and not able to fit into the film pack. Now I want my first exposure to be just the camera. That should be nice and simple. I'm just going to cut out the square in the middle here, carefully following my pre-made cut lines, and I'll throw it away. I'll go ahead and cut out my index mark with the tiny square in the corner, and then I'll peel away the template and use the blade of my knife to remove any leftover tape if there is any. And that's mask 1 done. And now you can see if this is sitting on film. The only light that will touch the film has to come through the square. That's where I want the camera to show up on my film. Mask 2, however, is going to be a bit more tricky, because now I need to somehow block out the camera section of the film and expose everything else, kind of like a stencil. But how can I do that if it's not going to be connected to anything? You could do this with laminating adhesive, which is a huge headache that I do not recommend. Or you can just use some cheap transparent plastic mylar sheeting that I got off of Amazon for like $8 for a pack of 15. These aren't perfectly transparent, but they're infinitely better than the laminating adhesive, and even that's good enough. So I'm just going to cut out the camera square here like we did in the first one, but I'm not going to throw this one away because we need to keep this one. And now I'm actually going to cut along the film square border itself. So now I have 3 separate pieces. I have the Polaroid frame, I have the film square, and I have the camera square. So first, I'm just going to go ahead and peel the template off of this black paper. And if there's any double-sided tape left over on the black paper, I'll just peel it off with the Eject knife. But it doesn't look like there's any. And then I'll go ahead and do the same thing to the film square while we're here. And I'm going to leave the template on the camera cutout because I want to keep the orientation correct on that one for now. And so now I'll just go ahead and cut out my indexing marks, that way I don't accidentally flip something the wrong direction and misalign my pieces. So this one, since it's the second exposure, is going to have that M-shaped cutout. So now I'm just going to go ahead and grab some double-sided tape, and I'll put it on the back of the Polaroid frame cutout. I'm doing this because in just a second, I'm going to stick this to our mylar, because we need most of this to be see-through. So I'll just lay my mylar down, and I'll try to align the edge of the Polaroid frame with the edge of the mylar, leaving an overhang of a couple millimeters, just enough to cut off later. Then I'll set the film square piece onto that so that it snugly snaps in place like I never cut it out. That way, it fills in most of the empty space, but I'm not using double-sided tape on this one because it's only there as a guide. Once it's situated, then I have the exact position of where I need to place my camera square. So now, I'm going to go ahead and take the template off of the camera square cutout. And keeping very careful track of what side is the front and what side is the back, I'll put double-sided tape on the back of the cutout, and I'll press it down onto the plastic so it fits neatly into the space we cut it out of. Now, I'll press down on the frame cutout and the camera square, and I'll remove the film square. So now I have this black square just sort of floating in space, which is what I need so that my head is blocked out of the photo. But to keep it in place, I need to seal everything together. So now, I'm going to cut this whole section of mylar off. And then I'll just go ahead and cut the mask section off of the mylar, completely separating it. Now I'm going to do the same thing we did a minute ago with the double-sided tape. I'll stick it to the mask in all the important spots that I want to keep fixed in place. Now I'll place my second piece of mylar on top of that. Then I'll press down really firmly to make sure it's all stuck together and sandwiched nicely in place. Then I'll use my ruler as a straight edge, and using the Eject knife, I'll trim all the excess mylar off the edges of the mask. And then I'll trim the plastic off of the indexing mark as well. And now that that's done, I'll just use some packing tape to seal the edges a little bit and really make it all stick together. One issue with using the Mylar laminated masks is that the corners can snag on the film cassette when you insert them. So one of the added benefits of using the packing tape to seal the edges is that you prevent those edges from snagging on the film cassette. So now, if I hold both of these masks up together, you can see how they line up pretty closely. So I can effectively put one image, the camera, in the cutout square, and the other image, my shoulders, will take up the rest of the photo. Kind of like this. And with that, you should have everything you need to open a whole new creative door for your Polaroid photography. I've never tested any of this on the newer Polaroid cameras, but it has worked flawlessly on my 3 vintage cameras. So good luck, happy shooting, and if you have any questions, please feel free to message me on Instagram or comment below.